ringing, oh, won't it be wonderful there?
Last night I mentioned about starting this series when I was a senior in college. I was in a biology classroom, upper division class, where we were asked to do 2 different lectures, and we only had 20 minutes. And I gave my lecture, the second one, on the subject of paleontological evidence against evolution. Now, my professor was a devout evolutionist, didn't really appreciate the subject matter, but I was so glad I gave that talk when, on my way to the University Center to check my mail, there was a classmate in that class who came up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "I'm 22 years old, I've got a job teaching biology this next year in the public school system, and until today, I had never heard that there was another option besides evolution." He said, "I assure you, when I start teaching school and teaching biology, I'm going to present both sides of the story." And so I'm glad you're here. And if you're not a believer, I'm especially glad that you're here. And I would just ask you to have an open mind, to think about these things as we present them, primarily from science, but we're also going to look at the Word of God. So we're talking about science versus evolution. And I want you to know why this subject is so very important. A number of years ago, my wife and I went to London on our way actually to Germany. And we stopped and we went to the British Museum of Science. What a magnificent building that is. It's like the Smithsonian, but in England, where you can go and you can see the things that are there for free. And you walk in the door, and this is magnificent hall that is, I don't know how many stories tall it is, but it's just all open. At the far end of the hall, there is a stairway. And you'll notice in this picture, there's people stopping at the top of that first flight of stairs, and they're looking at something. And what you see them looking at is a statue of Charles Darwin. And it's almost like they're just giving honor to this gentleman because of what he has done. Well, you turn left and you go up the next flight of stairs, and you immediately see this display on human evolution. And so you see these primates and you see man, and then you see also a display that shows the family tree. The family tree of where we fit in with the primates according to the general theory of organic evolution. Right there was a parent talking to the children and explaining to them how man had evolved. I mean, this is the purpose of this kind of display, to convince us that this is how we got here. And so many people believe this story, and then they share it with their children. They don't just get it in school, but their parents teach it to them. And I was just amazed looking at these people telling their children how we had evolved from a common ape-like ancestor. I've had the privilege of lecturing in Boston, I think about 8 times. And twice when I've been in Boston, I've gone across the river over into Cambridge to go to Harvard University, and I've gone to their Museum of Natural History both times that I was there. In fact, that was one of the main things that drew me to that. And when you go in to Harvard's Museum of Natural History, what you see, much like you saw the pictures I was showing you of the British Museum of Natural History, is you see a display showing how we're related, according to evolution, to the primates. And then you also see a comparison with the human skeleton and that of a monkey, showing the similarities in our skeletal makeup. And then you see a display showing the family tree. And it was amazing to me that not only were people, there were parents with their children gathered around in London telling their children this story. There in Harvard, there was parents with their children pointing out to the displays about how we've evolved from a common ancestor with these primates. Well, you know, you can go to almost every museum of natural history. I went to the one here in Houston not that long ago. My sister took us there, and there you go, the Houston Museum of Natural Science. And it shows a display of how we're related to the primates. And this time it wasn't a parent, but it was a high school student who was a volunteer. And that volunteer, he had a group of young people gathered around, and he's explaining to them how we're related to the primates, that we have all evolved from a common ape-like ancestor. Well, then you go to Washington, D.C. I'm a key opinion leader for a dental organization, one of the largest manufacturers in the world, and they had us there for a meeting. Well, I had the afternoon off. So I grabbed an Uber and I went to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. I've been there before, but this time I went with a camera. And so I went, I was taking pictures. And there in the Smithsonian, what do you see? You see how they say, are related to the primates. Well, I want you to notice this quotation taken from one of the signs in Harvard, where it says, evolution, like the theory of gravitation, is an essential truth supported by overwhelming scientific evidences. When I was in school, I was told that it was a theory of organic evolution. But yet, they always taught it as a fact. They use the word theory, but they teach it as a fact. This is teaching it as a fact. Oh, they may refer to it as a theory, but they say it's just as much of a fact as gravity. And gravity is pretty much a fact. Nobody questions gravity, really. So this evening, we want to talk about the Bible. We want to talk about evolution, because they're certainly in conflict with each other. You just go to the very first verses of the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible. You look at Genesis chapter 1, and it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was waste and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said that there was light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening and morning one day. So on the first day of creation, God made the heavens and the earth, light, day, and night. On the second day, he made the firmament, and it says evening and morning, a second day. And then on the third day, after the earth was made on the first day, he makes the sun and the stars. Well, I'm ahead of myself, aren't I? That's the fourth day. The third day, he makes the dry land and the plants. And on the fourth day, he makes the heaven and the stars. And then, on the fifth day, he makes the birds of the heaven and the fish of the sea. And on the sixth day, he makes all the land animals, and he makes man. Then in chapter 2, in the first 3 verses, it says, and the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work, which he made, and rested on the seventh day from all of his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because that in it he rested from all of his work which God had created and made. I want you to notice that on the seventh day, the last day of that week, God no longer was in a creation mode. Creation was over. It was finished. Creation took place in those first 6 days. Now I want to ask you a question this evening. Are Genesis 1 and 2 and Exodus chapter 20, are they fact or fiction? Are they the truth, or are they a fairy tale? I believe we have an eyewitness account. The one who made it, God, is the eyewitness who had it put down on the pages of the Bible, and I believe the Bible is an eyewitness account to creation. But many of our educators, talk show hosts, religious leaders, they're going to tell you that this is just a fairy tale to believe in creation. And if you believe in creation, you must believe in fairy tales. So what I want to start out with is looking at evolution. I want to put evolution under a microscope, if you will, and we're going to ask, is evolution fact or is it fiction? And we're going to do it with 3 questions. Question number 1, what is evolution? It's really important to understand the subject we're talking about this evening. And I think when we have just defined evolution, we're going to see a lot of evidence that shows that evolution is not true. And then we're going to talk about science versus evolution. We'll talk more about that tomorrow night. And then tomorrow night, we're going to talk about why not theistic evolution, why you cannot believe the Bible and believe in evolution. The two just don't go together. Now, with that said, what is evolution? And when I use the word evolution, I'm not meaning just change. The word change in general, we all believe in change. I mean, I'm getting older. I look a lot different than I did when I was a 3-year-old, and I behave differently than I did when I was a 3-year-old. That's changed. And in some ways, you can use the word evolution to respond to that, but that's not what we're talking about. When we use the word evolution, I'm not going to go to the trouble to say the general theory of organic evolution every time. When I say evolution, you just know that I'm talking about the general theory of organic evolution. So what is it? Let me tell you, it's not a fact. It's not a fact like a lot of people treat it. It is a theory. And it's a theory that says this: the theory that all living things have arisen by a materialistic, naturalistic, evolutionary process from a single source, which itself arose by a similar process from a dead, inanimate world. This theory may also be called the molecule to man theory of evolution. Molecule to man theory of evolution. We're talking about how you go from an atom to atom. We're talking about how you go from goo to you. And it should not be confused with a special theory. But before I look at that, let's notice Charles Darwin's comment. He said it's a truly wonderful fact that all animals and all plants throughout all time and space should be related to each other. So if you believe in the general theory of organic evolution, you believe that you're related to the oak trees, to the grass, and to all the animals. Let me tell you, this green evolution we got going, where I'm familiar with the church in the Austin area that couldn't build its church building for a while because they were afraid it was going to disturb the habitat of a beetle. And then there was another organism they were worried about. Finally, they were able to establish that building right where they intended to build it. But you see, when you start thinking that we're cousins with oak trees and cousins with birds and insects, that really changes your behavior quite a bit. And again, this general theory of organic evolution should not be confused with the special theory of evolution. Actually, the special theory of evolution is a fact. And it just describes the process of selective breeding or adaptation within a species or within a kind. So within a kind, it's a fact that there's a lot of room for horizontal variation. We all know that. For an example, you take a Cocker Spaniel and you breed it with a poodle. What do you come up with? A cockapoo. And you breed a Pekingese with a poodle and you get a peekapoo. That's a fact. And if you breed a golden retriever with a poodle, you get a golden doodle. My dog at home, Shiloh, she's almost that. She's what we call a golden doodle doodle doodle. When we got interested in her, we thought she was a golden doodle, but it turned out she's 3/4 poodle. But you see, you can have that. And when you get through breeding those dogs with dogs, you still end up with a dog. This is a fact. We're not talking about this. What we're talking about is, can you go from an amoeba to a fish to a horse and ultimately people? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the general theory of organic evolution. This is a fact. There are 200 plus varieties of bluegrass, and yet they're all just grass. There are 300 plus varieties of rye, and still it's just rye. This is a fact. You can't, though, turn grass eventually into oak trees. That's what the general theory of organic evolution says, that you start out with a grass, you end up with an oak tree, a redwood tree, or other plants. That's not a fact. I am told that there's 1,300 varieties of roses. But ladies, a rose by any other name is still a rose. So we don't want to confuse the special theory with the general theory of organic evolution. Now, why did I go into the trouble of explaining that? It's really important to understand the difference, because evolutionists very commonly do what is known as bait and switch. They show you one, they switch it to another. And how they do that is this. They show you the fact of horizontal variation within a kind. They show you the special theory of evolution, how you can have dogs with dogs end up with dogs. They show you that, and then what they say is that proves vertical change. That proves the general theory of organic evolution. That proves that you can go from chemicals to bacteria to amoebas to animals with exoskeletons. We're talking about animals that have their skeleton on the outside. You know, bugs, crustaceans, a crab, a lobster. And then you go from that to animals that have endoskeletons. They get rid of the exoskeleton and they have a skeleton inside like you and I have. You go all the way to that to have fish and then people. That's what they do. And you're saying, really? Do they really do that? Well, yeah. Here's one of the most common ways in which they do it. They talk about the peppered moth. Biston betullaria. The peppered moth comes in various shades of gray, but the principal two varieties are typicals, which are light colored, and the melanics, which are dark colored. Now you'll notice in the screen on the left, there are two moths. One's dark, one's light. To the human eye, the light one looks more camouflaged. And then there's a dark tree, and there's two moths. There's the dark one, the light one, and to the human eye, the dark one's more camouflaged. They show this in almost all of the general biology textbooks. In 1955, Bernard Kettlewell, who is a British physician, he called this Darwin's missing link. Darwin didn't have the missing links. He says, this is it. This proves evolution. And then in 1975, P.M. Shepard, who is a British geneticist, called this, I want you to get this, the most spectacular evolutionary change ever witnessed and recorded by men. What he's telling you is this is the best proof they have got for evolution. I keep putting it in the textbooks because they believe it. That's the best proof for evolution. The kids are taught it. They believe it. Best proof for evolution. But I want you to look at this just a little bit. The story they tell is that in the 1800s, most of the peppered moths were light colored. Most of them. Not all of them, because there was both white and dark. But then the Industrial Revolution took place, and all that pollution, the smut, it polluted a lot of trees, especially the lichens on the trees. And so it darkened these trees. And that did happen. And then the peppered moths became predominantly dark, melanic. Following the 1950s, especially after the Clean Air Act of 1956, industrial melanism began to decline. In other words, it reversed. So what they're saying is before you have pollution, you got these light colored trees, and most of the peppered moths, not all, but most, are light. And then you've got all this pollution, you got dark trees, and you have more dark moths. And then when you clean up the environment and the trees are going back to being light, you have most light moths. Does that prove evolution? Does it? Or do you have any questions? You know, most of the time we as students are in the classroom, you've got the guy with the white coat and he's telling you this is the way it is and this is the proof, and most people just kind of memorize it and put it on the test. I think this falls far short of a mechanism for evolution. I want you to think about it for a little bit. The only thing that happened is a change in proportion. You see, it started out with light and dark, and they end up with light and dark. And then they go back to still having light and dark. Where's the evolution? There's no evolution taking place. What you have is no genetic addition of material. But we call this a change in demographics. What do you see in this picture? You see a community that looks kind of like mine. When I was in high school living in Dumas, Texas, we were about 85 to 90% Anglo-American, about 10% Hispanic, and 2 families were black. I went off to college, and went off to dental school, and I came back, and in 1980 things had changed. And we have gone to about 77% Hispanic in the school system. We have a large number of blacks and Asians and people from Burma and Somalia and the Sudan. Does that prove that evolution took place in Dumas, Texas? No, nobody would believe that story. What you see is a change in demographics. Let me tell you what happened. While I was off to school, they built a meat packing plant. And that meat packing plant had the need for a lot of jobs. When I moved in, there was people who were refugees from Vietnam, from Laos, from Chile. And for all these years, it was always a perfect place for people who needed jobs to get a job. If you don't have a job here and you want to move to Dumas or Cactus, Texas, they got a job waiting on you. It's not easy work, but they've got a job that's waiting on you. What do you see here? You see different people. They look different. Greatest fighter of all time, Muhammad Ali, but you kind of wonder what would have happened if he ever fought Wilt Chamberlain, who was so much taller. And then you look at these other people. Is this evolution? No. These are people just in their different variations. So when we think about these pepper moths, there's a few things you ought to know. If we take their story as they tell it, it doesn't show evolution. It just shows demographic changes. But I want you to think about this. First of all, they're showing these pepper moths on tree trunks. Do you know that tree trunks is not where pepper moths hang out? It's not. They hang out usually on the underside of leaves. There are a couple of instances where they've seen pepper moths on trunks. And one of them you're looking at right now, where these pepper moths were dead and they took some pins and they stuck them through the moths and stuck them to the trees so they could get a picture. This is not where they typically hang out. And then you ought to also know about the actual demographic distribution. It's not consistent with their story. In rural East Anglia, England, there was very little industrial pollution. So you would think the typicals are better camouflaged. But you know what? They were only 20%. The Melanics were 80%. Now there's something else you ought to think about when you're listening to stories like this. You see them being camouflaged, but you know what they don't talk about? They don't talk about how animal eyes are different than our eyes. You know that the sensory organs of certain animals are more acute than ours. For example, a dog. You can take a dog whistle and blow it, you'll never hear it, and your dog will either be aggravated or come running because they can hear it. Their ears are different, but their eyes are different as well. I wish I had, what do we usually say when someone's got great eyes? Eagle eyes, because you can have an eagle way high in a tree, and he can see a fish under the water that you can't even possibly see. Not to mention the fact that when light hits the water, it's refracted and it bends. Our eyes don't make up for that. Theirs do. An eagle can be a couple 100 feet away, make a dive, and hit that fish exactly where it is under the water. And you and I have no chance of even seeing that. You see, what we think is camouflage, we just assume it's camouflage for something else. Not necessarily. And when you start analyzing the story, what you see is what you were told, not necessarily the truth. In South Wales, the Melanics are better camouflaged than human eyes, but they only reach 20%. After the anti-pollution legislation, the Melanics in North London decreased as expected, but the Melanics south of London increased. It was totally unexpected. In the 1970s and 1980s, biologists realized that melanism was not well correlated with environmental changes. And yet, this is the best proof that they have for evolution. That's what the evolutionists say. And it's in textbook after textbook, and it just keeps being there. Quite frankly, when I think of this story, I just say, well, bless their heart. That's the best they got, bless their heart. I'm actually embarrassed for the scientific community to try to pull this over on the public. Because the only ones that actually believe it are people that don't think. I'm telling you, the very best researchers are people who think and they question. They don't just accept whatever's taught in the classroom. That's what makes a great researcher. Be a thinker. So, the peppered moth story, it's built on fake news. Even if it was completely true, it still just speaks to demographic changes and not evolution. Still in the textbooks to, quote, prove evolution. And do you think this speaks to academic honesty? How does it get in the textbooks? It's beyond my imagination. You've seen an example of academic bait and switch. You've seen an example of academic flim-flam. An example of what is supposed to be Darwinian evolution, also known as natural selection and survival of the fittest. That's supposed to be the mechanism for all of this, and yet you didn't see it at all. You just saw flim-flam. It differs from selective breeding, natural selection does, since there's no intelligence directing it. Charles Darwin's theory as to the process whereby organisms are better adapted to their environment survive, his idea is the main process that brings about evolution is survival of the fittest. Now that you've seen that, let's go to another one. That's one of the favorite ones that it's been shown nowadays. Where I live, and a number of y'all said you've been through the panhandle of Texas where I live, and you'll notice that when you go from Amarillo up to Dumas, you see all this canyon country, and it's part of that big canyon drainage system down into Paladura Canyon, which is the second largest canyon in North America. But once you get to Dumas, it's just flat. It's flat on the east and the west and the north, and you see these huge plots of grain. Many times you'll see a section of corn, and in the air you look down, and there's sprinkler systems that go out a half mile, and they make a circle. And a section of land is 640 acres, but it's also a mile square. And that sprinkler system will water that entire mile square. We have big time agriculture where I live. And we primarily raise corn and maize and then some wheat. And what do? To keep the bugs from devouring it, we spray. We do truck spraying, we do aerial spraying because we want to kill those harmful bugs. And so what's been happening is the pesticides are now being resisted more and more by certain insects. And what they're saying is, you know what? You're seeing a change within these insects because this is evolution. You have insects that are more resistant to pesticides than there used to be. Now, if that story's true, you see horizontal variation. You don't see vertical change. You don't see bugs turning into people. But just read what they even put out. Now, this is taken out of a textbook that is used for honors biology students. Probably y'all have it here in this area because it's an honors biology Texas textbook. And so you open this up. I had one of the biology teachers loan this book to me, and I was reading through it, and I was looking at this, and I said, well, this is pretty interesting. Because what you see in this top area up on the screen is pictures of these bugs. And then they start telling about it, and what you know is that there's no change in DNA. You've got, from the very start, before the pesticide starts getting sprayed, you've got bugs that aren't resistant. But then you have some slight DNA changes in other bugs of the very same kind, and they're already resistant. So when the spray comes down, the insecticide that kills the bugs, it kills the one primarily that are not resistant. And that leaves the bugs that are already resistant. They're alive, so what do? Well, bugs multiply. That's what bugs do. And so the more they multiply and the more you spray the ones that aren't resistant and you keep the ones that already were, and now that's what you got. See any evolution happening there? I sure don't. There's been no genetic information added. It's not evolution even on the micro level, much less the macro level. It's just survival. So when we talk about evolution, I want to ask you, you see a little bit of science fiction here? There's nothing wrong with science fiction movies if you know right up front they're science fiction, but they're teaching us this as science when it's actually science fiction. So we ask about beneficial mutations. Really, mutations are the result of damaged genetic information, often a loss or distortion of genetic information. And most of these changes are not even fertile. In fact, favorable mutations essentially don't even exist. Mutations are different than intelligence-driven genetic engineering and gene therapy. When you got brilliant scientists manipulating the genes, we understand they can change things within a kind. You still don't have them turning bacteria into other animals and eventually people. So evolution, what is it? It's a theory. It is definitely not a scientific fact. For a theory to be scientific, it needs to be amenable to the scientific method. I know there's some scientists in the room this evening. You'll probably agree with me when you've been on scientific teams, you've sat down like I have when you're going to research something and you talk about the process. We would always talk about specifically the scientific process, how we were going to be able to observe what we were experimenting with and observe the processes that would lead to what we thought was going to happen, but then we were going to come up with a way of falsifying the results. In other words, a way to prove what you found is not true. Because science a lot of times is more about falsification and having the inability to disprove it. So you've not really proved it as much as you just can't disprove it. That's a scientific method. And all scientists will tell you that's exactly what they do. And it's on this basis that the evolutionists point their fingers at the creationists and say that it should not be considered a scientific theory. Listen carefully. I agree with that. Creation is not an ongoing process. It's not something we can observe. And if we can't observe it, then you can't consider it a scientific theory. Creation is never claimed to be an ongoing process, and it's one of the reasons I read Genesis chapter 2, 1 and 3, and I emphasized that God said it was over. On the seventh day, He rested. He's no longer creating. I mean, at the beginning, God said that. But there's a difference with evolution because evolution claims to be an ongoing process, whereas creation is a historical event. Evolution is unproven and it's not subject to the experimental method. So, if evolution is not a historical fact, which we know it's not, and if it's not a scientific theory, then what is it? Well, it's a philosophy on the origin of the universe. It's a philosophy on the origin of life. It's a philosophy that says if you take a frog and just instantaneously turn it into a prince, that's a fairy tale. But if you take a frog and give them 300 million years, you'll get a prince, and that's guaranteed. Professor George Wald, Nobel Prize-winning biology professor at Harvard, he was actually a biochemist, said time is in fact the hero of the plot, given so much time the impossible. He says that evolution is impossible, but it becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain, when as only to wait time itself performs miracles. So evolutionists will say that given time it performs miracles. And a philosophy on origins that requires miracles, what is it? It's a religion. That's the definition of a religion. Professor Louis Bonjour said evolutionism is a fairy tale for grown-ups. This theory has helped nothing in the progress of science. It's useless. Dr. Tim Tasmisian of the Atomic Energy Commission says scientists go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men. And the story they're telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. Not one. H.S. Lipson, professor of physics in the United Kingdom, said, in fact, evolution became, in a sense, a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it, and many are prepared to bend their observations to fit in with it. So I'm not the only one saying that evolution is religion. Many scientists are seeing it that way. In fact, Sir Arthur Keith, I want you to notice who he is. He's an evolutionist. Sir Arthur Keith was such a noted evolutionist that he was able to write the foreword to the 100th anniversary edition of Origin of Species by Darwin. You don't ask a creationist to write that foreword. And here's what he said. Evolution is unproved, and it's unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. Really, you have just seen the greatest proof for evolution. The greatest proof, quote unquote, for evolution is just not wanting to believe in creation. So, evolution is a religion that is atheism. From the beginning of time, there's always been two choices. Either God made the world or it made itself. Evolution is a religion that is atheism. It is a religion that contradicts the two most basic laws of all science. We've talked about this earlier in the week, how the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can be converted from one form to another, but it cannot be created nor can it be destroyed. And with that, we need to understand the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. The word entropy means disorder, and what it says is the total amount of disorder is always increasing. In other words, the world's running down. And any energy transfer, whether it's physical energy, chemical energy, nuclear energy, transfer of energy, there's always a certain amount made unavailable for further use. You can't continue to burn the same tank of gasoline in your car forever. It's being transferred into a form you can't continue to use. So really the law of entropy says this, that the world is wearing out. But the evolutionist says, no, we want time because time is our hero. And given time, the world just gets better and better and better. It's not so. Time is actually the enemy of evolution. Think about this for a moment. You see this picture of Sue at 20? Some of you guys that are 20 or 22, you might want to meet Sue. But look at Sue at 90. And if you think things have changed, look at Sue at 3,000. She's changed. Time's not the hero. Evolutionists assume that adding energy, because you've got this open system, will overcome the second law of thermodynamics. Open system? We're talking about the universe. We're talking about all of the energy in the world. And when you talk about all of the energy in the world, there is no more energy. So there is no open system. There may be an open system there that's open for you putting energy from here to there, but when we're talking about the whole world, you don't have an open system. That is what you have. And so the universe is actually a closed system, and adding energy is destructive unless you have a complex mechanism to harness the energy. The Japanese in 1941, they added a lot of energy to Pearl Harbor, and they didn't create anything, but they destroyed a lot. We couldn't get them to stop the war. We battled back in our defense, We bombed Tokyo because it's made out of wood. It had burned to the ground and they still weren't going to quit. So what do? We finally had to just say, well, we're going to use those atomic weapons. And we put them in on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and we didn't organize a thing. We laid them flat to the ground. You put the sun on your car long enough, well, what happens to your vinyl top? You put it on your paint job long enough, what happens to the paint job? It is destroyed. The sun's energy will destroy your roof, and it'll actually destroy your house or your apartment building given enough time. You see, you have to have a complex mechanism to harness the sun in order to be able to use it in a constructive instead of a destructive way. That's what God has done. When He made plant life, He created plants with chloroplast. And in those chloroplast is chlorophyll. And it's a very complicated molecule. It's similar to hemoglobin that's in our blood that is also a very complicated molecule. You see, that molecule is very complicated. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And chlorophyll B will capture energy and transfer the highly energized electrons into chlorophyll A, while chlorophyll A is also collecting energy and transferring this into a food that plant can utilize. And ultimately, because we are all animal life, either eating plants or eating animals that have eaten plants, so much life is dependent upon this complex mechanism to harness the sun's energy. But evolution, it goes against the first and second law of thermodynamics, the two most basic laws of all science. It contradicts the law of biogenesis, which says to have life, you got to have life. It also contradicts the false concept of spontaneous generation. You see, spontaneous generation doesn't happen. Louis Pasteur proved that in the 1800s. Things just don't come out of nowhere. And when you got a pond, developing pond scum, it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's microorganisms growing. And he also showed that's the same thing that was spoiling the milk and spoiling the wine, taking it from sweet to alcohol to vinegar. People, until Louis Pasteur, thought it just happened. But then he showed, no, there's a reason. It's the bacteria. Evolution is a religion that evangelizes by academic peer pressure. There's a lot of pressure put on students, especially in colleges, to believe evolution. I remember at Texas Tech, which is one of my alma maters, they had a biology professor, and he may still be there. And interesting is his PhD was a thesis and research project in whale food. In fact, specifically, it was in the sea tick. And very popular speaker. People just loved him. And but he would tell them, if you don't come into me and get my recommendation, you won't be able to get into medical school or dental school. Now, that wasn't the truth. That wasn't even close to the truth. I've served on the admissions committee for the University of Texas Dental School. I know what it takes. That's not close to the truth. But he'd tell them that. And he said, if you don't come into my office and tell me that you fully believe the general theory of organic evolution, I won't write you a letter of recommendation and you can't go. See, there's a lot of academic peer pressure for people to believe in the general theory of evolution. Pierre Chardin, the Catholic priest, said, evolution is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses must henceforth bow in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, which all lines of thought must follow. That is what evolution is. And really, academics look at everything through the eye of evolution. I was given this series of lectures up near Norman, Oklahoma, where the University of Oklahoma is, and there was a gentleman in the church who was in the graduate school program for English. And he came up to me after the lectures. He said, what you said is so right on. He said, even in English, evolution is being pretty much crammed down our throat. Richard Dawkins, who is such an anti-believer, such a pro-evolutionist, said it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person's ignorant, stupid, or insane. So there's a lot of academic peer pressure because nobody wants to be considered stupid. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels said if you believe a lie or you tell a lie long enough, loud enough, and often enough, people will believe it. Well, that's how they control the people in Germany. Hitler also said the people are more likely to believe a big lie than a small one. And that's what evolution is. It's a lie. Now, for the remainder of the time we have, we're going to talk a little bit about some more science against evolution. We want to talk about, first of all, is it mathematically even possible? What are the odds? This is the problem. What are the odds that unthinking molecules can turn themselves into thinking human beings? Is that going to happen? Well, without even looking at numbers, let's look at a mathematical possible problem. And I know that Sister Fight is so glad we didn't do this the other night because the young people were invited over to their house Sunday night. We had a Bible study. But what if we'd have come over to their house and gone into the kitchen? We got all the ingredients you need for a cake. You got the sugar and the flour and the baking powder and the egg, and you just throw them on the floor. You would have done that with me, I know. And we clean it up, and we go over here and we throw it on the floor somewhere else. And we throw it on the floor somewhere else. And we just keep doing it all night long. You ever going to come up with a cake? What are the odds? You got all the ingredients. Well, if that would work, think about this. Take all the parts to an automobile and put them in a concrete mixer. Turn it on, just start cranking. Give it enough time, will you come up with an automobile? No, mathematically, that's just not going to happen. And so we ask, how much more intelligence then would be needed to have life? Brilliant scientists have failed to create life. How could blind, stupid chance create life? Is it mathematically possible? You'll notice one of the things the evolutionists never do. They never go to math because math goes totally against evolution. Mathematicians agree that anything that has odds greater than 1 times 10 to the 50th power is mathematically impossible. But it only takes 42 parts to come up with that if those 42 parts have to be lined up in a certain way. We talked about this the other day where if you line up pennies, put them in your pocket, you know, if you only had one, you're going to be able to go in there blindly and that's, you're going to get it right the first time. You put in 4 pennies and you got to get them out in the right order, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's only 1 chance in 24 that you're going to get it right. 50 pennies, it had to be pulled out in that order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way out to 50. It's 1 times 10 to the 50th power. You're never going to have it happen. 42 pennies. 100 parts doing it that way. 1 times 10 to the 158th power. 200 parts. 1 times 10 to the 375th power. 500 parts. The odds are 1.22 times 10 to the 1,134th power. Anything as complicated as just 42 parts that have to be lined up in a particular way cannot happen by blind chance. So let's consider a 200-part system evolving. Kind of like the pennies, we're going to pull them out. We're going to do a chance every second. So it'd be like me going with 200 pennies in my pocket, and I'm going to pull them out 1, then 2, then 3, and you go all the way out to 200. And somebody's thinking, well, Bonner, you can't do that in a second. I know I can't, but I can do it with a random number generator in a computer. And so we do that with a random number generator. And we just run this every second, randomly. You know, if the world is 10 billion years old, then it's only been here 1 times 10 to the 18th power number of seconds. So you take something with a 200-part system, it has to be lined up in a particular way, you give it 10 billion years, you do it every second, and still the chance of it ever happening is only 1 times 10 to the 357th power. In other words, it's 0 chance. There's not been enough time in theoretical evolutionary time for evolution to take place. Someone says, what about the single cell? Well, you know, evolution can't even occur on the cellular basis. A single cell has a quadrillion atoms, and they all need to be lined up in a particular way. A cell has the information content of 1 times 10 to the 12th power. You just can't randomly come up with a cell. It'd be kind of like this. To simplify it, what if you and I were flipping coins, and I came up with 30 heads in a row? What would you think? Do you think we had a fair game going? No. You think I'm cheating? You think I had a double-sided coin that the only way to ever come up was all heads? Let's say we do it 60 straight times. I don't believe in gambling, but if we had money on that and I got 60 in a row, you'd come after me with a gun and get your money back, wouldn't you? Yet the same evolution says that the far less probable evolution just kept coming up like a cosmic casino with straight flushes over and over again. Never going to happen. Evolution is a mathematically impossibility. Organic macroevolution is essentially science fiction. You saw the definition earlier in the evening. The theory that everything living came from a materialistic, naturalistic, evolutionary process, which itself arose from a single source. And we call it the molecule to man theory of evolution. Let's talk about molecules to man. First of all, you have to give them the molecules because something cannot come from nothing. You can never get the evolution to explain first cause. Where did that matter come from? Well, they want to talk about the cosmic egg and how all of the matter in the universe is 1 time smaller than just a single proton. So it's almost nothing, but still not nothing. They won't try to explain where the original matter came from. It's kind of like a friend of mine, an oral surgeon that's been a buddy of mine for a long time. One time he said, Bonner, it kind of reminds me of God having a discussion with this atheist. This atheist said, well, you know, God, I think I can do what you did. And he says, what do you mean? He says, well, I think I can make man out of the dirt of the ground. And God says, well, let's see you try. So the atheist gets down there, he starts to pick up some dirt, and God says, oh no, make your own dirt. You see the point? You have to give them the original matter. They cannot explain where the original matter came from. And it's science fiction to say that something can come from nothing. It's science fiction to say that matter has always existed. That's just not true. So what you do is you got to give them the matter, then you got to give them the cosmic egg, and then what they say is, what happened? That matter that was in the cosmic egg, smaller than a proton, all of a sudden had an unbelievable release of that unbelievable gravity. Because for all the matter in the universe to be down to a single proton, that's an unbelievable amount of gravity. But then something made it release. If you've got that kind of gravity, why would it ever turn loose? But they say it did, and that's called the Big Bang. It all flew apart. What overcame that unbelievable gravity to cause the Big Bang? Nobody knows. It doesn't make sense. And then they say the next stage is inflationary. In other words, all the matter in the universe just flew totally apart. And as it's flying apart, then it started coming back together and coalescing to form galaxies and solar systems and planets. This story seems like to me to be science fiction. But they say the solar system evolved 5 billion years ago, with the planet Earth evolving about 4.6 billion years ago. And that all matter came from the original element hydrogen. Think about that. Atomic number 1, atomic weight 1.00794. They say that, and they don't talk about this that much, do they? That everything in the world was just helium. And all the other elements, all 118 of them, evolved from helium. And from this element hydrogen, we get the universe and we get life. And we say, well, how do you do that? Well, there's 2 different theories we've got. Number 1, that it came from the meteorites. In other words, it came from outer space. Well, if it did, it's still in the universe. Where did it come from then? But Sutter's Mill meteorite, April 2012, gave them some evidence that it might have come from outer space. They don't know that it did, but that's one of the theories, and they were theorizing that way before this meteorite. You have to ask, is that science fiction? And the other is just chemical evolution, that it all evolved from hydrogen. That periodic table that most of you have seen, elementary, junior high, high school science, 118 elements, that it all evolved from hydrogen. That it went from hydrogen to oxygen to organosin. And you have to ask them, what is the mechanism for that kind of evolution from hydrogen turn into all of those? And I've never really heard an adequate explanation. But this is a theory that everything came from that original hydrogen. What's the mathematical possibility? Yeah, it's pretty poor. But then, in the textbooks, they want to go to chemistry. And this is what's pretty interesting to me. They call this the Miller-Urey demonstration of creating organic molecules. One of my good brothers, Brother Dickens, is a biochemist. He knows where I'm going to this. This is one of the poorest attempts to try to explain organic evolution. But here's what they did. They set up the glassware, and we're going to see if you can evolve organic molecules. So this glassware is isolating everything from the outer environment, oxygen. Because what I'm getting ready to show you, it cannot happen if oxygen's in contact with it. Now they're saying, here's how you evolve organic molecules. But I want you to notice what you have to give them. You have to give them methane, which is an organic molecule, you see. So to evolve organic molecules, you have to give them organic molecules. And then you have to forget that they're having to isolate this in glassware because it can't happen, again, with oxygen in contact with it. Let me tell you, when I say highly intelligent scientists, I'm not saying that facetiously. I mean, organic and bioorganic chemists have synthesized over 20 million organic compounds. But the idea of this happening by blind chance, in the presence of oxygen, that cosmic soup, the primordial soup that's laying on planet Earth, with oxygen in contact with it, you can just have life evolve? That's an impossibility. Can this evolve on its own? Not a chance. But then it has to be in a cell membrane, because you have to have it in a cell membrane for it to live. We talked just briefly about a cell membrane the other night. And what I want you to know about this cell membrane is you have to have a cell membrane to have these proteins, and these proteins can't function without a cell membrane. And to have a partial membrane is worthless. You have to have a fully functional, completely intact cell membrane for the cell to live. And that's why we talk to our young people about meiosis and mitosis. And mitosis is the cell division of somatic cells, of body cells. And we show this diagram you see up on the screen so they can understand that this cell division happens when you have one cell becoming two in such a way where there's never an opening with the cell membrane. So these two cells start off with completely functional cell membranes at the very start. Because we know without a fully functional membrane that it dies. So now what we've got is we've got hydrogen that evolves into all of the table of elements, all 118 of them. And then you got the cosmic soup. Well, that doesn't work unless it's in glassware, but give it to them. Just say you do. Okay? And then we evolve the organic compounds. And then they've got to get a cell membrane around that's fully functional. You can't evolve a fourth of one that turns into a half of one to three-quarters of one. It's got to be fully functional. And then you've got to have life in this membrane that starts out as a prokaryote. Maybe some genetic material in it. but no nuclei. And then that's going to develop into eukaryotic cells that have the nucleus inside the cell and all of the organelles, the components in the cell. I told you the other night that cell biology starts in college with 2 full semesters, and cell biology is primarily biochemistry. This is highly complicated, and they will say, well, that just happened by blind, random chance. Any mathematical possibility? I would say no, that's science fiction. So when they give you this big view of history, that it started with the Big Bang 10 to 20 billion years ago, we end up with life on this earth by just happening, by natural causes, there's not any truth to that. And tomorrow night, we're going to look at this geologic time scale. We're going to look at it for about 4 to 5 reasons that this does not show evolution to be true. But that time scale is supposed to represent the evolutionary tree, how everything evolved from that original cell to all the plants, and then all the animals, and ultimately to man. The deal is, you need to know tonight, the progression of that evolutionary tree is not in the fossil record. One of the most famous evolutionists that's ever lived, he's now gone, is Stephen Jay Gould. He was a Harvard professor. And Stephen Gould said the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. The rest is inference. However reasonable, it's not the evidence of fossils. So when you go back and you look at that evolutionary tree, he says we don't come up with that looking at fossils. He says it's no evidence in the fossil record. And then you look at Dr. Colin Patterson, the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I'll lay it on the line. There's not one such fossil. So he was asked, when you wrote that book on paleontology, why didn't you put these transition forms in there? He says, I would if there were any, but there's not any. David Ropp said in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, they've not been found. Yet the optimism has died hard and some pure fantasy has crept into textbooks. So Darwin issued a challenge. And he said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case. I think this evening we've already seen a number of cases. If you go get a degree in biology and you understand the truth of what we're talking about tonight, you're going to see a lot of cases. In fact, we call this irreducible complexity, where biological organisms are so complex, there's no way for them to slowly evolve into what they are now. But I want to answer Darwin's challenge with 2 things. One, the bombardier beetle. Bombardier beetle is fascinating. He's got a tail that works like a machine gun that a tail gunner has. His body manufactures noxious chemicals that are shot out of his tail at about the temperature of boiling water. That tail can swing and shoot at those predators like ants, spiders, frogs, praying mantis. And it's remarkable. How did it evolve? When you think about it, it had these glands that make up these chemicals. But then it had storage tanks, kind of like all these chemical tanks you have all the way from Pasadena to Baytown, Texas. You got the plants making them and you got the storage tanks keeping them separate. That's what this bombardier beetle has. Glands to make the chemicals, storage tanks to hold them, and then he's got a mixing chamber with diaphragms and enzymes that can mix this all together and then shoot it out the tail, and the tail aiming at the predators. So my question is pretty simple. What came first? The glands? With no tanks? Or did he evolve the tanks thinking, well, in the future, I can evolve the glands? So if he evolved the glands and the tanks simultaneously, what about the mixing chamber? When did it come? Or did that come first? And then how about that gun that he has? Or did he evolve that first, thinking that in the future I can evolve the glands, the tanks, and the mixing chamber? You see, this is called irreducible complexity. You can't evolve this one step at a time. Darwin says, just show me anything that can't happen that way. I think we're showing everything can't happen that way, and this is a pretty prime example, but I'm going to finish on this one. When you have bacteria, they have a way of moving around. Some of them don't have flagella. Some bacteria will have a single flagellum. Others will have multiple flagella, and these flagella are pretty remarkable. These flagella, they don't shake. They rotate, just like the motor on the back of your motorboat. And you think about, how did this thing evolve? You start looking at it on a molecular basis. And in this cell membrane of a bacterial cell, you have made up of these molecules forming a rotor. But to make sure the rotor works right, you've got to have a stator, and then you've got to have a universal joint. You've got to have bushings like we've got in our machines, and a lot of you engineers are familiar with. You look at it even more close up and you see it's exactly that, all the way down to the molecular level. And the question is, how in the world did this evolve one step at a time? The rotor first? Or the stator? Or the universal joint? Which came first? You know what? It had to all come at the same time for it to do any good at all. And this is another sign that irreducible complexity shows that Darwin was wrong, he's still wrong, and God is right. This world could not have evolved as the evolutionists tell us. So evolution's a theory, but it's not a scientific theory. I would suggest it's science fiction. We're unafraid to be investigated. John 8:32 says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. The question that remains this evening is this: will you accept the Bible as God's Word? I think this week we've shown you strong evidence for that. And I encourage you to think about the things that we've been teaching. We're going to finish tomorrow night with a lot more evidence from science. But we're also going to specifically address that question, why you cannot be a theistic evolutionist and believe the Bible. But perhaps you're here this evening and you already have seen enough to know that you're ready to become a Christian. And if you're ready to become a Christian, we want to extend to you the invitation. Why not become a Christian? It's the greatest life on earth. It's one in which we know where we're going. We know why we're here. And we know that our Lord and Savior has saved us if we'll just do what He asked to do. Do you need to respond to the invitation? If you don't, you do it now by coming out in the aisle and coming forward as we stand and sing this invitation song.